Corn doesn't tell you what's underneath it, not from above, not even from a drone flying low enough to count individual stalks. I've farmed this ground for 43 years, the last 31 of them running my own combine through harvest after harvest, and the one thing every farmer who's worked this land long enough eventually learns, usually the hard way, is that healthy-looking crop can be standing directly over ground that's gone soft and unstable underneath it, and nothing looking down from above, whether it's your own eyes or a satellite, is ever going to show you that particular kind of trouble until you're already sitting in the middle of it. My name is Walt Brennan. My granddaughter, Sadie, finished her agricultural technology degree 2 years ago and came straight back to run digital operations for our family farm, the same 1,100 acres my own father worked before me, and for the last 18 months, she's been the driving force behind Harvest Sync, a satellite and drone imagery routing system built to optimize our combine's harvest path across every field we work. This is a story about Sadie, about a system she genuinely believed had solved a problem that had cost our family real money and real close calls across 3 generations of farming this ground by feel alone, and about an October afternoon when Harvest Sync routed our combine directly across a stretch of ground that looked perfectly healthy from above and had, underneath that healthy canopy, gone soft enough to nearly roll a $250,000 machine with my grandson inside it. Harvest Sync came online across our operation 18 months ago, a platform built to optimize combine routing using satellite and drone-captured crop imagery, analyzing canopy health, density, and yield potential across every field to calculate the most efficient harvest path, minimizing wasted passes and maximizing acreage covered before weather windows closed. Sadie had pushed hard for the system from the moment she came back to the farm, arguing, correctly, that 3 generations of routing a combine by memory and gut feel had left real efficiency on the table, particularly during the narrow, high-pressure windows before an approaching storm when every extra pass across already covered ground cost us acreage we might not get back before the rain came. Harvest Sync's imagery updates every 6 hours during active harvest, Grandpa, she told me, more than once, standing in the same kitchen I'd eaten breakfast in my whole life. It's not routing off a map from last season anymore, it's routing off exactly what the canopy looks like right now, today, across every acre we're working. That's a level of precision 3 generations of this family never had access to before. I don't doubt the canopy imagery's accurate for what it's actually measuring, Sadie. What I'm telling you is that a picture of healthy corn from above tells you the corn's healthy, it doesn't tell you a thing about what the ground underneath that corn is doing, and I've driven this combine over soft ground that looked perfectly fine standing over it, more than once across 31 years, in spots no satellite was ever going to catch from up there. I want to be fair to what Harvest Sync actually got right, because this isn't a story about a system built carelessly, or a granddaughter who'd stopped caring about the people actually running the equipment the moment she came back with a degree full of new ideas. Harvest Sync's routing had genuinely saved us real time and real acreage across 2 harvest seasons, exactly the kind of careful, defensible engineering Sadie had built her whole return to the farm around, and I never once doubted she believed in it completely, right down to riding along in the cab herself more evenings than not to watch how the routing actually performed in the field. What the system didn't have, and what nobody building it had fully understood the danger of, was any way to see through a healthy canopy to the ground condition underneath it, a fundamental limitation of any imagery-based system looking down from above. That meant a stretch of ground gone soft from a failed drainage tile buried 3 feet down could sit directly beneath crop that looked, from a satellite's perspective, exactly as healthy as every other acre around it, giving Harvest Sync every reason to route our heaviest equipment directly across ground it had no way to know was unstable. Sadie had grown up on this farm the way I had myself, spending summers riding along in whichever cab happened to have room for a kid small enough to squeeze in beside the driver, and I remembered her, even as a girl of 9 or 10, asking endless questions about why we drove certain routes and avoided others. Questions I hadn't always had good answers for beyond a kind of accumulated instinct I'd never bothered to fully articulate. I think part of what drew her back to this place after school, more than the business itself, was a genuine desire to finally put language and data behind exactly the kind of knowledge she'd watched 3 generations of this family carry around without ever quite writing it down, and that desire was part of why our disagreement over Harvest Sync's blind spot never once felt, to either of us, like a fight about whether she belonged back on this land. I need to explain the specific hazard this story turns on, because it's the actual center of everything that happened that October afternoon, and because it's exactly the kind of underground condition a canopy imagery system, built specifically to analyze what's visible from above, was never designed to detect, no matter how sophisticated its analysis of the visible crop became. Our northeast field carried a network of clay drainage tiles installed by my own grandfather nearly 70 years ago, buried lines that kept that particular field's heavier soil from waterlogging during wet seasons, a system that had worked reliably for decades but that, like any infrastructure that old, had begun failing in isolated sections as individual tile joints cracked or collapsed over time. One such failure, roughly 40 yards long, had developed sometime over the previous winter in a stretch running diagonally across the field's northeast corner, a collapsed tile section that left the soil above it chronically waterlogged and soft, even though the corn growing directly over that exact stretch, drawing on the same excess moisture that made the ground unstable, had actually grown slightly taller and greener than the surrounding rows, exactly the kind of visual signal that read, to any canopy health algorithm, as some of the strongest, healthiest crop in the entire field. I'd first noticed the soft ground myself nearly 8 months before this story's events, walking the field on foot during spring planting, feeling the ground give slightly underfoot in a way I recognized immediately from 31 years of walking this exact land, a soft, spongy give that meant standing water sitting closer to the surface than it should have been. I'd mentioned it to Sadie at the time, more in passing than as a formal warning, not yet understanding how directly it would eventually collide with a system I was still getting used to trusting. HarvestSync's canopy imagery for that stretch is showing some of the strongest yield potential in the whole northeast field, Grandpa. If the ground were genuinely unstable there, I'd expect stressed, weaker-looking crop, not some of our best readings. That's exactly the problem, Sadie. The corn's growing strong there because it's sitting in extra water it shouldn't have access to, not despite the soft ground, because of it. I want that stretch flagged and driven around manually regardless of what the imagery says about yield potential, at least until we get that tile line properly inspected and repaired. I'll get the tile inspection scheduled for after harvest, but rerouting around 40 yards of some of our strongest looking corn based on a walk you took back in the spring is going to cost us real acreage this season, and I need something more than a soft patch you noticed 8 months ago before I build a permanent exclusion zone into the routing system. I remember standing in that kitchen understanding exactly where Sadie was coming from, even as I disagreed with the conclusion she'd reached from there. She wasn't wrong that a permanent exclusion zone built off one spring walkthrough was a real cost against a season's yield, and I wasn't wrong that the ground had genuinely given underfoot in a way I'd learned, across 3 decades, not to ignore. The trouble was that I didn't yet have anything more precise than my own 2 feet to offer her, no survey, no sensor reading, nothing that would translate cleanly into the kind of data her system actually knew how to weigh. My own father used to say that a farmer's boots were the oldest sensor this land ever had, and that no amount of new technology ever fully retired the job those boots were built for, a lesson I'd absorbed so completely across 31 years that I hadn't yet found the words, that spring, to explain it in a way that could compete with a satellite image showing some of our best corn of the season. The afternoon this story turns on was the 3rd week of October, a significant storm system forecast to move through within 36 hours, HarvestSync's dashboard calculating an aggressive optimized route across our remaining unharvested acreage, including the northeast field's diagonal stretch, prioritized specifically because its strong canopy readings promised some of the best yield per hour of anywhere left to harvest before the weather closed the window entirely. My grandson Cole, 19 years old and running the combine solo for the first time that autumn, was working the northeast field's optimized route when I drove out on the 4-wheeler to check progress, arriving just as he approached the diagonal stretch I'd flagged 8 months earlier, the machine's massive weight bearing down on ground that had spent a full spring and summer soaking in water it had no business holding. "Cole, stop right there, don't cross that stretch running diagonal through the field, that's the soft ground I told your mother and Sadie about back in the spring. HarvestSync's routing me right through there, Grandpa. It's showing the best yield readings in the whole field along this exact line. I don't care what the yield readings show, that ground's been sitting wet for 8 months from a failed tile underneath it. Back that machine off this line right now and swing around it, we'll take the loss on this pass rather than find out the hard way what's actually holding this ground together." I want to describe what I actually did next, because it fell squarely within my authority as the farm's senior operator and, honestly, within the one rule every generation of this family has followed since long before Harvest Sync existed, that ground a person has physically felt give underfoot gets treated as unstable regardless of what any crop looks like standing over it. A rule my own grandfather taught my father and my father taught me decades before any of us had a satellite telling us anything different. I climbed up onto the combine step myself and watched Cole ease the machine into a wide, careful reverse, backing off the diagonal line and swinging around the flagged stretch on solid ground instead, a maneuver that cost us perhaps 20 minutes and a modest strip of unharvested corn we'd need to come back for later, considerably better than the alternative I'd spent 31 years specifically trying to avoid. I stood on that step the entire time, one hand braced against the cab frame, watching the ground beneath the massive front wheels the whole way through the reverse, the particular held breath quiet of a man who'd felt this exact kind of ground before and knew exactly how quickly it could go from merely soft to genuinely dangerous under 9 tons of moving steel. Once the machine was clear, I climbed down and walked the diagonal stretch myself on foot, sinking nearly to my ankle in ground that gave way considerably more than it had even during my spring walkthrough, standing water visible just beneath the surface in a way that left no real doubt about what would have happened to a machine that size crossing it under full harvest load. I called our tile contractor directly that same afternoon rather than waiting for the scheduled post-harvest inspection, describing exactly what I'd felt underfoot and asking him to prioritize an emergency assessment of that section before we lost any more of the season to a storm that was still bearing down on us. The contractor arrived within 2 days, running a ground-penetrating survey along the full diagonal stretch, confirming a collapsed tile section running nearly 45 yards, considerably longer than the section I'd flagged from feel alone, groundwater pooling directly beneath roughly 6 inches of surface soil that had gone soft enough, in his professional assessment, that a fully loaded combine crossing it under wet autumn conditions carried a genuine, serious rollover risk. 45 yards of collapsed tile, Walt, and the water table sitting close enough to the surface that I wouldn't have wanted to walk that stretch myself, let alone drive equipment across it, he told me, standing at the edge of the diagonal line with his survey equipment still recording. The corn growing over it makes sense once you see the water data. It's basically been getting irrigated all season by a broken drain nobody could see from above. I photographed the survey results myself and called Sadie directly rather than letting the report reach her secondhand through the normal family chain. Sadie drove out to the field herself within the hour, having heard enough over the phone to understand this wasn't simply an old man's caution about a spot he didn't trust, and I want to describe the conversation honestly, because it wasn't simple vindication for either of us, even with a genuine collapsed tile line and a near miss with her own younger cousin sitting in hard fact in front of both our eyes. 45 yards of collapsed tile, and Harvest Sync routed Cole straight across it because the canopy above it happened to be our strongest looking corn in the whole field, Grandpa. That's not a marginal miss, that's the exact scenario you described to me 8 months ago, sitting right here where I can finally see the survey myself instead of just hearing about a spot you didn't trust. I've been telling you that healthy corn can be hiding trouble underneath it since last spring, Sadie. I didn't have anything beyond a feeling underfoot and 31 years of walking this ground until this week made the gap impossible to keep deferring. This wasn't the system malfunctioning, it was the system doing exactly what canopy imagery does, reading strong growth as a good sign, in the one specific situation where strong growth actually meant something had gone wrong underneath it. Which is exactly the gap I need to sit with, and I know that now in a way I genuinely didn't let myself believe 8 months ago, when you first mentioned it in the kitchen. I wasn't dismissing you because I'd stopped respecting what you know about this land, Grandpa. I came back from school wanting to prove that everything 3 generations of farming by feel could be improved with better data, and I think I let myself believe better data about the crop was the same thing as a complete picture of the field, right up until this week showed me the one thing no satellite was ever going to see. I know that, Sadie. I'm not angry at you for wanting to bring something new back to this place. I've watched you save us real time and real money these last 2 seasons, and I've never once wished you hadn't come home with all these ideas. I'm telling you that the one time it mattered, some of our best looking corn was sitting directly over ground that could have rolled that combine with coal inside it, and the only reason we're standing here talking about a tile repair instead of something considerably worse is that this family never stopped teaching each other to trust what the ground itself is telling your feet, whatever the crop above it happens to look like. She was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the diagonal stretch where the survey crew's equipment still sat, and I watched her run the same calculation I imagined she'd been running since the survey results reached her, the particular engineer's math of how many other fields, across 18 months and however many acres Harvest Sync had routed us through, might have carried the same invisible gap between what the canopy showed and what the ground underneath was actually doing. I keep thinking about the version of this week where you hadn't driven out to check on coal yourself, she said, finally, still looking at the equipment, or the version where you'd stopped mentioning that soft patch after I pushed back last spring, because I'd come home with a degree and you didn't want to seem like you were standing in the way of everything I was trying to build here. I don't like sitting with how much of this week came down to you personally deciding a feeling underfoot couldn't ever become optional, no matter how good the yield numbers looked. I don't love sitting with that either, Sadie. A system this good shouldn't need one old man's boots as its last line of defense before a combine rolls with your cousin inside it. That's not a compliment to me, it's a description of exactly the gap we both need to close. You've built something genuinely good these last 2 seasons, and I've never once told anyone in this family otherwise, but genuinely good isn't the same as complete, and I think somewhere in these 18 months you let yourself believe a picture of healthy corn was the same thing as a picture of healthy ground, when this family's known better than that for 3 generations now. What Sadie and I built together over the following months, working with a soil moisture sensor network she researched and installed across our most vulnerable fields, was a standing protocol layering subsurface moisture data directly into Harvest Sync's routing calculations, flagging any stretch where soil saturation readings diverged meaningfully from what canopy health alone would predict, closing the exact gap that had let 18 months of otherwise excellent imagery-based routing miss the one kind of hazard sitting entirely beneath what any picture from above could ever show. I still walk a field myself before harvest whenever something feels worth checking, exactly as I did the spring before Harvest Sync existed and exactly as I will the spring after whatever eventually replaces it, though Cole, I've noticed, has started doing the same thing unprompted since that October afternoon, walking suspicious stretches on foot before he ever brings the combine anywhere near them. Sadie and I talk about Harvest Sync's ongoing refinement most evenings now, in the same kitchen I've eaten breakfast in my whole life, except the conversation carries a specific new weight neither of us fully had before that October push. She told me once that the hardest part of the whole episode wasn't researching and installing the moisture sensor network at all, it was sitting with how completely 2 clean seasons had let her trust canopy imagery as a complete picture of a field's condition, right up until her own grandfather's habit of walking the ground himself finally made the gap impossible to keep deferring. Corn doesn't tell you what's underneath it, not from above, not even from a drone flying low enough to count individual stalks, and what I've learned, watching a system my own granddaughter built get this one thing wrong for 8 months before finally getting it right, is that the most dangerous gap in a genuinely well-built system is often the one built into exactly what kind of picture it was ever designed to see in the first place. It took a collapsed tile line 45 yards long, a careful reverse out of a diagonal stretch, and a granddaughter and grandfather who trusted each other enough to argue honestly across a kitchen table 8 months before it mattered, to finally close a gap that 18 otherwise excellent months of engineering had never quite found their way to on their own.